Hello, readers. Today we're going to talk about Sally Rooney's most recent book and her fourth novel, Intermezzo. So it seems like it's probably appropriate to start off this video with some discussion of Sally Rooney as an author and her amazing popularity and whether it's warranted and all that. But other people have discussed this to death already, so let's just talk about the book. Earlier this year, I read Rooney's, at that time, latest novel, Beautiful World, Where Are You? And I didn't film a dedicated review on that one, but I did talk in one of my Friday Reads videos about it. I discussed how there is something truly remarkable to me about Rooney's perception and her writing style, but I felt for various reasons that that novel all sort of added up to nothing in what for me was rather a flop of a book. Granted, this wasn't the typical critical reception of the book, which was very well received, but it was mine. In general, it felt like a pretty safe book given what Rooney's already written, with a few ambitions or risks or new attempts that weren't really fully embraced and therefore didn't pan out. One of those is evident from the title itself, which unsubtly suggests something profound will be explored in the book, and for me the book just didn't really hit that mark. On the other hand, I did really enjoy Normal People, or at least I remembered enjoying it quite a bit. So I read it 5 years ago, so by this point, in reading Beautiful World, Where Are You?, I wasn't sure if Rooney had changed or if I just moved beyond her style, but I was still quite confident that there was something quite excellent about Normal People, that it wasn't just me coloring it with some fonder memory of it that wasn't really what I experienced at the actual time of reading. Of course, Normal People is also a very plain book in its own way, which is hinted from the very title, and I remembered it partially as a book that captivated me and that I understood to be exceptional in at least some way, but also one of those books where I just couldn't quite put my finger on what it was that I liked about it, if anything. Because the story it tells is in most ways very normal. It's the style and the detail with which it's told that I remembered giving it an exceptional quality. Anyway, picking up Rooney's latest and fourth novel just a few months after reading what I considered a disappointing third novel was a bit of an uncharacteristic move for me, an intermezzo of its own, if you will. In fact, uncharacteristic in several ways, although maybe not especially remarkable. As I already told you, I finished Rooney's previous book a few months ago, wondering if I ever really needed to read anything else by Rooney at this point. But this book had already caught my attention several times. And one evening I walked into the bookstore with some friends, just casually browsing before dinner, and I think it was the day after it came out, actually, and I noticed it there, and it stuck in my mind. And actually the very next day, on a snap decision, I went back to the bookstore in the mid-afternoon during my lunch break from work, purchased a new physical copy, which is pretty rare for me, especially for a book that's just come out, and then that evening headed to a coffee shop and sat and read the book for, as it turns out, 3 hours. From the first chapter, Intermezzo is doing something new and a little bit challenging for the reader, and that remains true throughout the novel, without ever shedding some of Rooney's trademark style that's made her stand out as a writer in the first place. I mean, it's not really a stylistic reinvention or a total veering off course for Rooney. It's more of a slight deviation in the manner of telling the story, and another attempt at some of the same writing challenges she's been focused on since she started writing. And this time Rooney really succeeds at these challenges she's taken on, of which there are many. She achieves something a bit stylistically different in the way that her character Peter experiences the world, but something that's not so unusual as to be totally jarring or as out of place as the epistolary interludes we get in Beautiful World, Where Are You? She explores philosophical or existential themes throughout the book, this time in a way that feels natural, inconclusive, and characteristic of now 30-something-year-olds like myself, or 20-something as one of the characters, Ivan, is. She continues to portray the complex relationships and internal workings of the brains of millennials in their 20s and 30s. And she manages these things in a way that is noticeable and laudable, but without, for me, feeling forced or heavy-handed. Some may disagree or dispute the fact that Rooney is being particularly innovative here. And, in these regards I've just mentioned, it's true she's not exactly revolutionizing contemporary fiction. Intermezzo is in some ways a safe novel, one that feels rather tidy by the end, but also one that at least moves beyond the spaces where Rooney herself has already traveled, or at least expands them. As always, we really get into the heads of her characters, and in this novel, the starring roles are occupied by two brothers, one in his early 20s and another in his early 30s. In Ivan, the younger brother, who is a chess prodigy, We might at first be afraid of getting your stereotypical nerd character, but I found from the very first chapter illustrating Ivan's perspective that Rooney captured both the actual challenges of a somewhat nerdy, socially awkward young man, but also the ways in which he's really not so different from anyone else, despite that he perhaps overthinks every action of his even a little more than everyone else. And that last point is really a feat for Rooney to pull off for this character, because one of Rooney's hallmark qualities is that she already highlights just how much even the more seemingly normal people among us tend to overthink things. But that's another thing that stood out to me immediately. Rooney is getting really up close and personal with characters who all feel quite different in their identities and ways of thinking, and managing to pull it off in a way that, to me at least, doesn't feel like it's missing something critical. First of all, she's chosen for the first time to really anchor the novel into male characters. She's written male characters before, but not in quite as central roles as the ones in Intermezzo, and in seeing the way she captures characters who, at least in some regards, must be very different from her here, I gain greater confidence that the way she's portraying characters who are different from me, or not quite like me, or her for that matter, has a lot of authenticity to it. And I really do believe this, because bringing back that character of the chess prodigy Ivan, I have seen this type of character done poorly or just okay so many times. How often in novels do we see a quote-unquote genius character who basically just seems to reveal to us the author's cluelessness about what it actually must be like to be such a person, who is written as sort of a discouraging stereotype of what the author and many readers must assume this genius or intellectual character to be experiencing inside, which is often an emotionless perception of the world as nothing more than a series of logical deductions and math problems. Granted, Ivan isn't a perfectly written character, and it does perhaps fall into these pitfalls here and there that reveal the author does not fully inhabit this world. Yet we do experience how he relies primarily on rationality and mental structure to balance his internal life, but without ever fully succeeding at this, and of course without actually being devoid of emotions or really less emotional at all than the rest of us. And that feels to me very real as someone who often relies far too heavily myself on rationality over emotionality. I will note that some reviewers seem to label Ivan as neurodivergent in some unspecified way, or even speculate whether he may be somewhat autistic. I don't mean to challenge this view too strongly, like that's great if such readers find he captures their own experiences, but to me, you can give him a label if you want, but he just strikes me as a very cerebral character. I'm not really sure he merits some diagnosis, or I'm not sure that to assign him one would really illuminate my understanding of him at all. And I guess with all respect to those who do perhaps see themselves reflected in Ivan in whatever way, who do see a neurodivergent character in him, though I'm not exactly sure what that means in this context anyway, since it's a very vague umbrella term. I personally would push back slightly upon that classification, because with Ivan, I don't feel that Rooney is trying to conceive of and develop a character whose mental experiences differ profoundly from her own. I think fundamentally she is trying to show us a character whose inner experience is, yes, different from her own in some ways, but really not that dissimilar from her own or from that of her readers. I think in general here, Rooney's emphasis lies more on the similarities than on the differences. I also don't think I'm really doing this topic justice, though, so I think there's definitely space for deeper conversations on this, too. In any case, it struck me upon my first sitting with this book, and it probably is no surprise to others who have read her work, that Rooney really must have spent a great deal of her life people-watching, observing others, and not only trying to understand them behaviorally as they appear to her on the outside, but really trying to inhabit their internal world and understand what motivates them, or rather how these motivations manifest in their thought processes and ultimately in their speech decisions and behaviors at the end. This is a book that, in achieving this sort of empathy so well, really inspires me to try to do the same. It makes us as readers want to take that extra step, makes us unsatisfied with simply understanding how others behave and express themselves, but instead to really want to explore how they feel and think as they behave that way. And perhaps nowhere is this up-close and personal style more obvious than it is in the narrative style Rooney uses for the character Peter. From the very first page, his sections are written in a sort of stream of consciousness, one which had me fairly concerned at first. We're basically dumped into his mind at one of its more disorganized moments without any context, and it took me several minutes just to get through the first half page. But to my surprise, the more the book went on, the more I found myself just absorbing and appreciating this style and this way of thinking and just flowing with it. We also learn eventually that Peter, who is going through a lot here and is kind of on a self-destructive spiral, you could say, Peter is using a lot of alcohol and drugs like sedatives or depressants of some sort, and when he is heavily under the influence of these drugs, his thoughts and his narrative become more and more disjointed as he perceives the reality outside him without really making any coherence of it, which is reflected through his narration. At other times, we get these passages where his thoughts are sort of racing, not really racing, but more just conveying his perception of he's figuring something out, it's making sense, maybe in the early minutes of his alcohol or drug consumption, as if he's achieved some real clarity, which surely enough begins slipping away once the sedation begins to sink in. There are also a handful of other, mostly women central characters whose lives we experience mainly through the eyes of Ivan and Peter, with one half exception in the character of Margaret. These characters, they too feel like very real people as well, but in this book, their most prominent role is in developing these two central characters, Ivan and Peter, it seems. Much as I found, for example, in Beautiful World, Where Are You?, the male characters served to develop the two central female characters. Simon Costigan, for example, in that novel, feels more believable and real as a character dominating Eileen's internal thoughts than one who actually had me truly immersed in his own personal experiences. Although one issue I had in that book is that I didn't really even feel those main female characters were really as compelling for me as they could have been, which wasn't a problem in this novel. Still, I really do find myself trying to experience the world from the perspective of Margaret or Sylvia or Naomi, the main three women in this book. I think it's not necessarily a weakness of this book. In fact, it's probably a good thing that Rooney didn't feel the need to spell out these characters for us entirely. But for all of them, they're going through struggles that we as readers will be curious about and intrigued by, but where we'll never really get to the same level of understanding that we get to with Peter and Ivan. Also, although this is a bit of a strange spot to insert this, before I get to talking about the women of this novel in a little more detail, I'm going to unleash the spoiler warning, because in order to understand them in any deeper way, I think we have to know some stuff about them that we really don't get until later on. So, spoilers starting now. Among the female characters, we have Ivan's love interest, Margaret, a character who early on in the novel does something that we don't understand exactly why, but we can tell by her internal monologue is very uncharacteristic for her and perhaps even is going to shatter her perception of her boundaries and her identity. Of the three central women in this novel, I think Margaret is probably the weakest, because unlike the other two women for whom it's clear will always remain a little bit on the outside perspective, never getting to see exactly what they're thinking, for Margaret we do actually get some narratives from her own perspective, and while these narratives capture some of her anxieties and character, such as her qualms about seeing a man who's over 10 years younger than her, and her preoccupation with how her ex-husband, who is technically still her husband, will judge her and get others to judge her for this decision, they don't quite achieve the level of texture that we might expect for a character who's getting to tell her own story. I think maybe part of the difficulty here stems from the very beginning when we, early on in the novel, get these POV sections from Margaret, but in those chapters she is deliberately hiding or suppressing certain feelings of guilt from readers or from herself. And while understandable, this prevents us as readers from ever fully entering into her broader headspace. Still, Margaret's experience in trying to understand what it means for her to have broken from the rules she normally follows in life, in grappling how she balances her own desires and her social stature in her community, is explored well enough that I still find her an interesting character, albeit perhaps just a bit underdeveloped in this novel. We also have Sylvia, one of Peter's romantic interests, his old flame, who broke off their relationship after being, I believe, in a serious car accident that left her seriously injured. I believe 6 years ago at the time the novel's taking place. Peter, we see early on, has never really recovered from this abrupt rupture that ended life as he envisioned it would be, and instead left him in this new space of aimlessness. We see this failure to move on, in fact, in his relationship with a college-aged girl named Naomi, in whom, despite her differences from Sylvia, we get the sense that Peter is perhaps trying to get back whatever he lost in his relationship with Sylvia from this new relationship, to pick up where things left off in a different relationship, sort of, which is of course impossible, not least because Sylvia is still very much alive, still his friend, and he still has feelings for her, and finds it hard to know what to do about all this. Sylvia is, I find, a really interesting character, both in relation to Peter and in her own right. She has been traumatically wounded in a way that basically forces her to find new sources of meaning in her life, which she does in a way that baffles and in some way disheartens her ex-boyfriend, Peter, who struggles to understand how such a life could be worth living because he struggles to understand even how his own objectively privileged life is worth living. He's a successful lawyer, he's attractive to women, doesn't face many outward struggles, but he still finds his life empty ever since the breakup with Sylvia. Between her and Peter, we also get a relationship that struck me as similar to a central relationship in Hemingway's book, The Sun Also Rises, which I read earlier this year, in which we have a character and a narrator, Jake Barnes, who's been wounded in the war and therefore is unable to have a sexual relationship with a woman he loves, named Brett, a woman to whom he remains unflinchingly loyal, but who basically cannot bring herself to commit to a life with him, cannot limit herself in this way, even though she does have a real emotional attachment to him that's always suggested to be stronger and more genuine than her attachment to any of the other men she's sleeping with, including her fiancé, Mike. However, here in Intermezzo, we gradually learn that Peter feels a bit betrayed by the fact that Sylvia broke off their relationship without ever really discussing more deeply with him what it would even mean for them to stay together. Sylvia is burdened by the notion that she could be a burden to others, specifically to Peter, in a relationship due to her disability and her perceived deficiency, and in doing so she makes a decision herself that she wants to end the relationship to let Peter be free, supposedly. It's an interesting and really fairly common dynamic. When we refuse to let others make what we perceive as sacrifices, and what maybe are truly sacrifices in some regard, when we refuse to let them go out of their way to care for us, telling them and ourselves that it's for their benefit, that we just don't want to inconvenience them, but failing to acknowledge maybe what's really going on is that we're just afraid of entering into a situation where we're not sure whether they're helping us out of love or out of a sense of obligation. Or even risking a situation in which they decide the sacrifice is not worth it, as occurs with Brett's rejection of Jake in The Sun Also Rises. Refusing to allow others the option to make sacrifices on our behalf prevents the possibility that maybe they actually want to make these sacrifices, instead forcing the outcome, but in doing so, refusing a different way of connecting. Counterintuitively, what we believe is an action of granting freedom to another person is actually just shackling them in a different way and avoiding the ambiguity, but also the connection that could arise from letting others choose for themselves whether to help us. And really the climax of this particular theme or exploration in the relationship between Peter and Sylvia comes in this beautiful scene later in the book where Peter picks up Sylvia's pain medications for her from the pharmacy because she, although she is initially kind of discreet or concealed about it, is having a pretty horrible day, physically suffering, not wanting to be seen in her current state, and as mentioned previously, not wanting to burden Peter with having to see her in this state. She tells him to leave the medication outside of her door and just text her when he leaves it there. Peter, however, feeling rightly disturbed by the knowledge of her suffering, sort of gradually gains her permission to enter the apartment, and in this deeply touching and symbolic scene that really represents a turning point in how the two of them perceive their relationship to one another, Peter basically, I think, finds Sylvia just lying on the floor of her apartment in pain. Her back is the center of this pain. And he administers her medicine. He cleans up her vomit from the floor and just spends some time here with her in what is clearly a pretty horrible moment for Sylvia, and just waits until her medication starts to kick in and she starts to feel a little better. And we see very clearly how this is not some perversion of charity where, Peter is here out of obligation to Sylvia and where Sylvia is being humiliated by her own weakness. This is really what both of them want to be happening in the first place. And therefore, it is, for me, one of the undoubtedly most beautiful and powerful scenes of the novel. I also really like, too, how Peter, although in many regards is not a very admirable character in this novel, we see how Sylvia really brings out the best in him in a way that seems to extend beyond purely the sexual or romantic attraction that he has for her. We get a sense of the man that Peter maybe used to be before the accident that he believes shattered his life. So Sylvia, for me, is the strongest and most vividly painted of the three central women in the novel. I was pretty much in love with her myself by the end. The third character, Naomi, is Peter's other love interest, of course. The relationship between Naomi and Peter from the start of the novel feels very imbalanced in both directions, really questionable. And because of this, also at times a little disturbing or maybe just unsettling. There's a little bit of this gross factor in that Peter is a man in his 30s dating a college girl, which, although not necessarily wrong in itself, adds to this sense of ambiguity in where this relationship really stands and whether it's And yeah, there is a clear sense here that quite possibly both of them are exploiting one another. Naomi for Peter's money and Peter for sex with this attractive young woman. This is, of course, made more obvious by the immediate acknowledgement that Naomi has been involved in exploitative relationships, or rather transactions for money, and has, I believe, sold nude photos of herself online to raise money to pay the rent. In fact, there is not really any easy and quick way of demonstrating to one another even, let alone the reader, that they are not exploiting one another. And even when we see inside Peter's own thoughts, it seems that this is kind of a questionable situation here. And Naomi is for us the most concealed of the three women characters. For her, we never really get into her mind at all. We only experience her through Peter's sometimes kind of icky or unflattering depictions of her, and then sometimes through the mind of other characters who also are not really the most charitable to her. However, throughout the novel, we do progressively begin to see that she is not exactly the insidious seducer that Peter imagines her to be at times. It's kind of a part of his paranoia coming in. So while we don't ever get a full sense of her internal experience, I think she works pretty well as a character that forces us and readers and forces Peter to dig deeper to overcome our initial perceptions of her, which probably will be rather negative even if we do have some sympathy for her, because Peter really casts her towards the beginning of the novel in quite an unsympathetic light. It's only much later that he begins to see she is actually serious in caring for him, and therefore he begins to have guilt about the fact that he's essentially carrying on relationships with two women at the same time, albeit not surreptitiously. They're both really fully aware that this is the case, so it's a complicated situation for sure. And these romantic relationships are all enjoyable to explore and form the bones of this novel, but the true heart of the story is really in the strained relationship between the two brothers. Ivan and Peter are not really on good terms and have only been in communication recently following the death of their father, which brought them back together into the same physical space and a similar emotional space, although they haven't talked with one another about this really at all yet at the start of the novel. But it gives them the idea and the opportunity that maybe they should try to reconnect. Partially, I think, because they've seen now that their father died in his mid-60s, that we can't take those around us for granted, and it might be a real shame not to connect with someone important to us while we still have the chance. Both of these two brothers, throughout the early parts of the novel, felt frustrating to the reader in their closed-off attitudes towards one another, but also sort of believable. Although we don't quite learn what it was that pulled the two of them apart until much later in the novel, in quite a devastating scene where we basically learn that Peter fell into a deep depression after Sylvia's accident, and that Ivan just didn't understand at all what was going on here with Peter, and was legitimately scared by his brother's abrupt change, and that Peter in turn felt betrayed or left hanging by his brother, who before that point had actually been quite close to him. It does have a bit of a feel of an avoidable miscommunication when it's presented to us as this revelation later in the novel, but the scene itself also feels believable, and I can at least sort of buy it, even if it seems like these boys, given who they are now, probably should have been able to resolve this earlier. But because we've experienced both of the brothers so closely, more than the romantic developments or the resolutions that occur by the end of the novel, which are satisfying in and of themselves, it's really the ultimate reunion of the two brothers that is really the most touching of all by the time the final chapter is finished. One thing that a few reviewers have alluded to, and I'm not quite sure myself how I feel about it, is that some of the characters here are made out in certain ways to be kind of edgy characters, but then by the end of the novel, they're not really quite so edgy as they seemed at first. For me, the most notable of these is probably Ivan, who we're told was involved in the incel community online as a teenager or a young adult, and who I guess held some pretty prejudiced but mostly unspecified views about women. If you're not familiar with the incel term, you can look it up yourself, but I'll just read the Wikipedia definition. Incel is a term associated with an online subculture of people who define themselves as unable to find a romantic or sexual partner despite desiring one, and blame, objectify, and denigrate women and girls as a result. However, Ivan has now, in basically every way that the reader can observe, moved beyond that. In particular, his relationship with Margaret in this book does not feel to me at all like it is challenged or complicated by the baggage of such views that he supposedly held earlier in his life. He comes across, if anything, as really quite courteous and going out of his way to understand her needs, and in a way that is not, just some kind of tactic to seduce her, but is showing us his genuine sensitivity and emotional depth here. So I'd have to say that although I guess it's fine as one sort of trivial piece of Ivan's past, and I can understand that his brother Peter would have been uncomfortable about this at the time and used it as one excuse for disliking or mistreating his brother, considering him unworthy of love, apparently, as a result of his controversial views. This all still feels like sort of a red herring in terms of character development as it comes up in the novel, because it creates some conflict that really does not illuminate Ivan's character at all to me. Ivan is not in any real way an incel character, and I'm not convinced that he ever was. I just get the sense from this book that as a teen or a young adult, he got involved rather superficially for a short time in some online communities that held some sway for him, but never really penetrated too deeply into his identity or way of thinking about the world. Otherwise, if she really is trying to depict someone who was deep into this community, I would say Rooney has failed here in showing us a character who seems to have moved quite rapidly and easily beyond this point where he was not that long ago, and seems to have pretty much shed any baggage or conceptions that he had at the time. And there's no clarification to the reader on what this process looked like for him. Another edgy character is Naomi, and with this character it's quite clear that Rooney intended for her to come across pretty negatively to us at first, but then to change our opinions of her as the story progresses. And part of this negative reaction is sort of a gotcha trick laid for us by the author, because first of all we learn that Naomi is, I guess if you want to put a label on her, we could just say she's a sex worker. I mean, specifically, I think she's on a few occasions shared nude photos of herself or videos or something in exchange for money with specific people. So this probably somewhat prejudices many of us against her to begin with. And then on top of that, our negative impression of her is really cemented by the fact that we're seeing her through Peter's eyes and through a certain paranoia that he has about her, and really not just through his eyes, but also through his peers' eyes as well, who all cast her as a manipulative seductress who's using him for his money. Which maybe reader opinions will differ, and maybe there is a hint of truth to this in the beginning as a sort of defensive mechanism against the power imbalance that exists in this relationship. But by the end, we have kind of seen that this is not really the case at all, and that on top of any such manipulation that may have existed, there is also some real sincerity and affection in her. Of course, as I mentioned, by the end, I think we kind of learn that her involvement in this world of sex work and illicit photo sales has been fairly limited, but I'm willing to grant that regardless of that, this is a real stigma that she and Peter have to overcome. So I find her more effective here as an edgy character. In one other example of the potentially edgy character, we have Margaret, who at the beginning of the book seems to be harboring some dark and mysterious secret. She's tormented by guilt and everything. We wonder what's wrong with her and how she'll overcome it. Margaret's dark secret is, of course, that she has recently left her alcoholic husband and isn't actually divorced from him at the moment, and therefore she feels guilt and society's watching eyes as she considers starting a new relationship. Now, although Rooney is maybe hinting at a little more than is really here at the start of the book, Margaret's situation, though extremely challenging for her, is not really that unusual at all. I think this works fine. There's not an easy solution to it, and although it may be a common situation, when we're going through real challenges that not everyone faces, we're really just not thinking to ourselves, oh, well, this is actually fairly common, so it's no big... We're just thinking, I'm not like anyone else, and it's horrible. So although Margaret's secret turns out to be not that much of a shocker to the reader, I still think her story works pretty effectively as an illustration of how what seems like maybe not such a big deal or so extraordinary to people on the outside can seem life-changing and can really be life-changing for the person experiencing it. And frankly, I think this made for actually a better story than one in which Margaret's story involved some kind of shock value. So those are the characters. What else is going on here in this novel? Well, as always, there are these little explorations of politics, of social issues, of characters searching for purpose and having a hard time finding it. But I find it much less heavy-handed and much more organic here than in a novel that's literally titled Beautiful World, Where Are You? And in which, in that novel, the central two characters spend tedious amounts of time writing letters to one another about the ills of modern capitalism, which have been brought upon us by the advent of plastics and other sort of annoying and slightly naive sounding ideological tracts like this one. All of Rooney's novels, of course, reveal a fascination with all the different factors that on a moment-to-moment basis shape the relationships between people, especially in one-on-one situations. She's interested in how shifting emotional dynamics, socio-political or even religious factors, and of course power dynamics, both on a personal and larger structural level, shape the way that people perceive and think about one another. Rooney has famously or infamously described herself and her writing as influenced by Marxism, and we know already from her previous novels that class dynamics often play a central role in the way her characters view and respond to one another. One of the more interesting aspects in Beautiful World, Where Are You? Is the initial disconnect that arises there between a successful and fairly well-off financially woman writer named Alice and a working class man, Felix, whom she meets through a dating app. This gap initially appears to be an insurmountable barrier preventing the two from connecting at all, although circumstances will bring them back together again to keep testing that boundary as the novel progresses. But bringing our focus back to Intermezzo, it's evident right away that we can't solely reduce Rooney's interests to the world of class dynamics. They extend far beyond that. Gender and power dynamics between women and men are obvious and a recurring theme, but there are plenty of others too. There's sexuality as a source of power, which comes up also in Rooney's other novels, but here at the start is very prominent in Peter's unhealthy relationship with Naomi. She's painted in the start as fairly unsympathetic in that she's at least somewhat manipulative, but also sympathetic in that she's financially desperate and driven to dire straits in various ways as a result. And especially since people will not really like Peter at the start of this novel either, I may have overstated how much people will dislike Naomi. I actually think that there will be a number of readers who will think, like, good for her, like, I hope she's taking advantage of this guy and getting all of his money because he seems like a jerk. There's also, in addition to these factors, there's moral righteousness as a source of power or as an imbalancing factor in a relationship, which comes up more in the storyline of Margaret, who feels as if she has used this moral righteousness card to escape her relationship with an alcoholic husband, since many around her have been critical of this decision, but she feels she'll then simply be a hypocrite if they all know that she has at the same time begun a new relationship while still technically being married. You can't really even list all the different dynamics at play between these characters because they're so numerous, but Rooney is keenly feeling all of them and fascinated by them in the way that she portrays these characters. And although Rooney has perhaps described herself as a Marxist in the past, which I think, depending on whom you're talking to, can mean a wide range of things, and I myself don't really have a clear picture of exactly what it means and where, Rooney does not really come across as much of an ideologue through her books. Intermezzo, certainly in particular, doesn't really devolve into some tired critique of the easiest to hate aspects of modern capitalism. Beautiful World, Where Are You? Did fall down this rabbit hole at times in the characters' letters to one another, that they are maybe realistic portrayals for people of the character's age and generation, but also are just kind of frustrating, as I feel I've already moved on beyond that sort of college or immediate post-college phase that, for many of us at least, involves thinking you now understand the world so clearly and really you're only just beginning to grasp anything at all. I'm not saying that I grasp it all, but I know that I don't grasp it at all at this point. What's dangerous is when you don't know. The characters in this book, Intermezzo, generally feel less naive, having learned something about the world, but being less confident or self-assured in their interpretations of it. As an aside, if you have access to the New York Times' podcast, The Interview, they aired an interview with Sally Rooney around the time this book came out, and I think it's quite interesting to hear her reflect on this novel and how she thinks about writing in general. She does seem to have quite an organic approach to the business overall. On top of this, there are some philosophical or existential passages in this book, but rather than appearing as some sort of disconnected asides in the characters' minds, they're typically, first of all, fairly subtle and also relate quite nicely to what the characters are experiencing throughout the novel. Peter is having a bit of a midlife crisis, to use the cliche term, realizing he's half as old as his father was when he died of cancer at the age of 65, which he considers and is quite early and shocking in a way, even though he's known his father was approaching death for a while now. Peter is really grappling here with his own mortality and with the feeling of perhaps not having used his life to this point as fruitfully as he could have, or not necessarily even that, because also there's a sense that he has used it fruitfully at times, but those moments are now done. He can't get back, his relationship with Sylvia, for example, at least as it used to be. Ivan in his journey grapples a bit with this sort of futile struggle we make to find solid ground or meaning to things. And there's this nice passage where he connects it with his other experiences. He reflects resentfully about how he used to explore certain philosophical trains of thought, and his brother Peter would basically refuse to engage with them and kind of dismissively say, oh, well, that idea's been refuted. Like, oh, you think we have free will because X, Y, and Z? Oh, no, that was refuted by blah, blah, blah. But to Ivan, whether his brother is technically right or not, this doesn't feel true in a tangible way. He considers that saying a school of philosophical thought has been refuted is like saying in chess that the king's gambit accepted line has been refuted, and the refutation is 3d6. So as an amateur chess player myself at times, this analogy is hilarious and frankly perfect. Like, the point here is that the supposed refutation to this opening, so you've both played 2 or 3 moves, and then black just has to make this 3rd move and then game over. Like, no, it's not, because it's not like, no, it's not, because like, unless you're a grandmaster or something, and maybe even if you are, you still have to play the whole game, even if maybe you have somewhat of an advantage here now. And similarly, someone might tell you that some philosophical train of thought has been refuted, and whether this is technically true or not, even if you accept that they're correct, like it's refuted, like if I prove to you that you have no free will, the argument is still often so abstract or disconnected from your daily life that you're probably then just thinking, okay, what do I do with that now? One other theme that I feel is at the heart of this book, and perhaps it's really a theme at the heart of literature in general, but I believe in this book it's there more obviously than for many others, and it's there in a very modern context. The theme is our struggle to maintain a coherent personal. The theme is our struggle to form and maintain an identity. We want to maintain a coherent personal identity, not only as we present it to others in our world, but also as we present it to ourselves. I talked about this a bit briefly in my discussion of Jane Eyre, which I was reading simultaneously with this book because it's also such a big challenge for Jane there. Throughout our lives, we're confronted with these situations and choices we have to make in which we're influenced by our sense of personal identity, who we are and who we want to become, but also by society's expectations of us. In Rooney's novel, many characters face such dilemmas, and one salient example of this is how Margaret faces this choice of whether her relationship with Ivan is a sort of uncharacteristic intermezzo that she can ultimately brush aside and say, it was a nice pause for my real life, but it's just not who I actually am, or whether this signifies a more lasting turn in how she views herself and the limitations she has previously conceived of for herself. Of course, a critic might fairly argue of Intermezzo, and perhaps even in the end of Jane Eyre as well, that at their conclusion, these novels enable the personal desires to win out over the societal pressures and constraints in a way that undermines any potential tragic element to these stories. Reader, I married him. Well, okay, maybe things work out for Jane Eyre in the end, but actually, in that case, it's only after she's chosen the path where things don't work out because she wants to stay true to herself and her role in the world as she sees it. On the other hand, in Intermezzo, Peter and Margaret both spend a lot of time pondering the dilemmas in front of them. Peter, his desire to sustain relationships with 2 different women, and Margaret, her desire to continue her relationship with Ivan despite her family's and her community's disapproval of this. But in the end, well, to Peter, a convenient solution presents itself in which he and his 2 lovers challenge society's constraints that it is placing on them. And for Margaret, similarly, it's not exactly that society takes it easier on her than she initially expected, but that's all kind of in the margins. Like, we as readers are just left off with an insinuation of, well, it'll be bad, but it won't be quite that bad, will it? And then it's left for the reader to think about, if they want, whether it'll actually be that bad, whether there'll actually be repercussions for Margaret. This is definitely a valid ending, and at least for Margaret and Ivan, it's the ending I really expected would happen throughout most of the book, but it feels as if we reached this point a little too conveniently, given all the struggle and potential conflict their story presented building up to this ending. I mean, it seemed there was always potentially an alternate ending there that some might argue would have been a more fitting ending, although I don't really have a stance one way or another myself, in which Ivan and Margaret separate by the end of the book because Margaret cannot fully shed society's expectations of her here. It's not as immediately emotionally satisfying, but as the end stands, it sort of supports this trap that we have in the modern psyche, that every conflict, every adversity, every emotional obstacle ultimately has an elegant solution to it. Have we become too much of compulsive problem solvers in today's world, refusing to accept the tragedy that also exists in life when we hit problems where there is no neat solution? I've been thinking a bit more recently about how nowadays I think we sometimes create struggling for ourselves by refusing to accept these tragedies of life and by seeking solutions in places where simple acceptance of life's unfairness maybe is what's needed. And I'm not saying that we should have some sort of resignation to what's in front of us, but a sort of commitment to change while also accepting the things that we simply can't change and that there are some of those things. I'll give a shout out to Patrick from Davude's reading group if you're watching, just for prompting this train of thought that I've been having lately during a lot of my reading. Now, if this novel is doing themes that have already been done many times over in classic works like Jane Eyre, why should someone nowadays pick up this book and read it? What does it offer us that's new? Besides, of course, that it has a really nice and Instagrammable cover. I'm kidding, of course, but also it really does have a nice cover. In fact, like, this is pretty nice, isn't it? I feel like it distinguishes itself from a lot of other covers I've seen. Also, I was just noticing the other day as I was paying more attention that, like, you have all the characters on here. And I was trying to figure out which character corresponds to each of the shadows. I couldn't really figure it out, but I am sure people have discussed this because I think it's an interesting puzzle of its own. Anyway, what does this book have to offer us besides a really nice cover? Well, yes, many of the themes in Intermezzo have been explored to death many times over, including the theme of death and grappling with one's mortality for that matter, which I didn't get into so much. That's really a theme that's lying underneath for much of the novel. I like the subtlety to it. It's there, but it's not usually on the forefront. It's kind of simmering in the back of the characters' minds, and you can understand how it's sort of fomenting some of the or catalyzing some of the actions that the characters take throughout the novel that they might not have taken otherwise. But anyway, this novel and Rooney's other novels situate themselves firmly within a present-day context, and one that feels now, not 10 years or 20 years ago, but today. Maybe it's no coincidence then that I largely enjoy Rooney's work, because I too am a millennial, basically the same age as Rooney, basically the same age as, not exactly the same age as Peter, but basically. And therefore, I'm intimately familiar with many of the precise concerns and anxieties filling the minds of Rooney's characters at this exact moment in history. In conclusion, sure, it's not a flawless or perfect work, if such a novel even exists, and I'm fine with that. I think it's quite exceptional, and I love this novel. I found it a wonderful reading experience. I finished it incredibly fast. In her portrayal of realistic experiences of millennials in today's world, Sally Rooney creates a sense of companionship for many of us who feel isolated or feel unusual in our everyday concerns, which I think turns out to be a whole lot of us, because her characters are not really as unusual as they think they are. And hopefully she challenges some of us to challenge our own rigid views of who we are and who we can be in the same way that her characters do. So thanks for watching, and happy reading.